While Michael Resman was a physical therapist employed at the State Hospital in Rochester, he became interested in the history of treatment of the mentally ill and disabled. Eventually, he wrote 2 books on the subject. We talked with Michael about the Minnesota State Hospitals and their well-intentioned but sad history.
If you're going to lock someone up for life and put them in that hopeless situation, that by itself is a horrendous thing. To me, the problem has always been and still is money. I'm Michael Resman. I'm a former occupational therapist. Now I'm retired. I'm an amateur historian and an author. My wife and I were looking for jobs. She's also an occupational therapist, and Rochester State Hospital had 2 jobs open, so we started there in 1972. I stayed at the State Hospital until it closed in 1981. Some of the patients that we were working with were chronic patients. They'd been in the hospital for 40, 50 years, had regressed as a consequence greatly because the environment that in those bad old days was really horrific. I had a number of patients, for example, whose language skills had decreased to the point they could only come up with a single phrase, but it was the only part of his language that was left. I had patients with nickel-sized dents on the sides of their heads from lobotomies. I had patients who had crushed vertebrae during electroshock treatments and they walked with a limp. So they'd really been through a horrific situation, and now here they were in 50, 60 years old, and there's not a lot of their life left, but their whole life had been ruined. Yeah, I really wanted their story to get out and have all the things that had happened to them not be for nothing, so that somehow I could be their voice. So I ended up writing 2 books. The first is the novel, The Mailman of Elmwood, and actually incorporates some story, the lives of some of my patients. And then the nonfiction book is Asylums, Treatment Centers, and Genetic Jails, which is as comprehensive as I could make it of a history of the Minnesota State Hospitals. There were 3 major periods in the Minnesota State Hospital history: the good old days, the bad old days, and the modern era. The early days, in the 1800s primarily, where the state hospital was being run largely by people off the street who were trained on the job, but they discharged over 90% of the patients in those old days with very little treatment available. But still, what they were doing was effective enough to allow them to discharge patients. Around 1900 came this theory of eugenics, which was the scientific application of genetics to humans. Science really became revered in the public's mind as being this hallbringer of wonderful changes. Well, in the science of genetics, it turned to eugenics, which was a way of preventing defective people from being born. Which would be a good thing because then they wouldn't suffer all their life. But it meant that you were completely ignored the rights of the individual who you're locking up. Lots of people have defective genes. In some cases, you can see that clearly that the person is mentally defective, but that means that if this person is mentally defective, their family members are also carriers of the defective gene. So be very careful about who you marry. Now, that kind of philosophy meant that patients, once they were identified, their families frequently just completely disowned them. Never visited, and I even heard stories in some cases that the newspapers would run an obituary when the person was committed. It's as if the person had died. I mean, they're not coming back. There was also an effort, of course, to hold costs down, and it was thought to be therapeutic to have the patients work. So they would work for no pay. And from the patient's perspective, they were happy to do that because the alternative was to sit on the ward for 40 hours or 80 hours a week in a day room on a bench and not do anything. So rather than do that, they went out and worked. And every state hospital actually was like a miniature community. They had dairy, they had raised animals, they raised crops, they processed those in canning and slaughtering. They had blacksmith shops, and they made most of their own clothes, their own mattresses. So they were largely as self-sustaining as they could be, which meant they were as inexpensive to operate as they could. the staff ratios ran as high as 1:60. So if you were in that day room and you didn't just sit quietly for that 8 or 12 or 16 hours, you became a problem patient. And you first would be restrained in muffs where your hands were tied. Then if that didn't work, they'd put you in a straitjacket where your hands are laced up and tied behind you. And if that didn't work, they'd tie the straitjacket to a bench or a bed. And some patients were in restraint for 20 years. Patients didn't always have enough bedding. Patients who stayed on the ward oftentimes didn't have shoes, just would be in stocking feet. So there were things that money could have assisted, but the basic premise of eugenics was the single biggest problem. There was a transition period in the 1940s to through the 1950s when, because there was no hope for patients, they started using some very intense, very invasive treatments. That's when we got the insulin shock, where they give somebody insulin and put them into a shock for 20 minutes. They did the electroconvulsive therapy, which at that time, they put electricity on the sides of the head and the person would have a full-blown seizure, which resulted in broken limbs and crushed vertebrae and very often chronically painful necks, and lobotomies. And the goal of all of these treatments was to have patients be calm, be under control, so that the staff could control them. They weren't expecting or really hoping for anything other than that. The third stage would have been late 1950s, 1960s, when psychotropic medications came in. And there was a very strong reform movement in Minnesota to treat psychiatric patients and discharge them. For the first time, Minnesota State Hospitals initiated individual patient care plans. And this, to me, meant that that was the first time they began looking at individuals and dealing with them on an individual basis, different regimes for different people, that they became a treatment facility, a hospital. And prior to that, really, in the bad old days, they were pretty much just a holding pen, because they didn't expect anyone to get out. If you came into the hospital with a postpartum depression, and 6 months later that woman was perfectly normal in every respect, she would not be discharged, because she had demonstrated that she had defective genes because of that depression. I think the most important thing that I learned in this book was documenting how behind we are right now. I did some research, and I was told that 1/3 of the inmates in the county jail are mentally ill, and an additional 1/3 are in jail because of chemical dependency issues. So 2/3 of the people we're locking up could benefit from treatment and could have benefited before they got into jail from treatment. Now, I can't say that they would not have committed some kind of a crime, but we are spending a tremendous amount of money to jail people who need treatment. Even at the emergency room, again, I was told that 1/3 of the patients that enter emergency rooms are there because of issues related to mental imbalance, that stress, that again, and emergency room visits, as we all know, are horrendously expensive. And if they don't have money to pay for it, we're paying for it. So we're seeing a lot of taxpayer dollars, we're seeing a lot of our societal efforts going into dealing with people with mental disabilities in a very ineffectual and, I think, inhumane manner. We've got patients who are living in poverty and living in isolated lives. We know better now. So in my mind, in a sense, we are doing worse right now today than we were at any other time in our history, because we are not doing what we could do, what we know we could do, and the only impediment is money.